Hi everyone. In this video we're going to look at how to add displacement to a Rhino model using sculpting tools in Maya. In previous videos we've looked at how to add displacement using textures and then turning on the displacement from within Rhino using those textures. And in this video we're going to use a different strategy. We're going to go from Rhino into Maya and use brushes in a more strategic way to add texture where we want in our model. And this is the type of thing that we'll be doing. This is a model that started in Rhino and then went into Maya and then had a few effects applied using the sculpting tools in Maya, and then we brought it back into Rhino. So let's show how we can do this. All right, so let me go ahead and go into the shaded view. And I'm going to turn off this and actually have a few things here. And let's go to this guy. All right, so how am I going to get this into Maya? The first thing I'm going to do is type export, and I'll call it Sculpt Test 2, and I'm going to use the FBX motion builder format. Hit save, and say yes to replace. Make sure that I'm mapping Rhino Z to FBXY. And oops, something goes wrong. And what's going wrong here? It shouldn't be asking me for polygon mesh options. This is telling me that this is not a mesh. And so this is the first thing we need to review. We want to take a mesh into Maya. We don't want to take a sub-D into Maya because then our mapping coordinates will be incorrect. So when I select this object, I can see that I actually have a sub-D here and I want to use a mesh. So I'm going to go back to this other layer and select this one, and I can see that this is a closed mesh. So the first thing we need to do is ensure that we're actually taking a mesh into Maya. The next thing we want to do is make sure that our texture coordinates are correct. And if you are unfamiliar with texturing in Rhino or creating a UV map like we're seeing here, I would encourage you to watch earlier videos in this series where I show you how to do this process. But this one I've already prepared, and I have used the unwrap tool to put seams into this model and then unwrap it into these pieces so that we can texture it. All right, so now that I've confirmed that this has a good UV map, I can hit apply or cancel, it doesn't matter because I haven't made any changes. One thing I'll point out is that we can see that there are darker lines on this model, and that's showing us where the UV seams are. And this is important simply because we're going to have to make a few tweaks to use this model in Maya. All right. So now I am going to file. So these seams are necessary for setting up the UV map. So you can see here that this piece has a darker line around it. And when we look at the UV map, we can see that that is now a completely separate piece. But we still have one mesh object here. If we look at the properties window, we have one closed mesh. And so keep in mind where these seams are because that will become important when we go into Maya. All right, so now I'm going to go to File, Export selected. I'll use FBX, the motion builder format. I'm going to overwrite this Sculpt Test 2, FBX, hit Save, replace it, yes. I have all of the options set up correctly here, hit OK, and we've exported our model. All right, into Maya. Okay, so Maya is a beast. Because it's set up for animation, there are many different menus, many different shelves here, many different windows and panels. I'm going to go over the core things you need to know to use the sculpting tools. So by default, let's see here, down here, I should be able to. So let's see. Oops, that's not going to work. All right, so the outliner, I can't toggle on and off, but if you don't see the outliner, it may not be all that important for what we're doing, but you can turn it off, or turn it on and off with a little toolbar or a little button over here. And I am not getting enough screen real estate to see that, but it will be found over here. All right, so let's first of all just import the model that we want to use for sculpting, the one we just made. So I have that right here in the folder, and I'm going to pull in Sculpt Test 2. Okay, by default, it looks like nothing came in, but I can see, in fact, there's this little locator here. If you're not familiar with Maya, you can hit the F key on the keyboard to focus on the objects in the scene. And once I've done that, I can see my geometry. If I want to see the lines of the mesh up here along the top of the viewport, I can click this little button that toggles on wireframe on shaded. All right, now it's done a funny thing where it's brought in this group. If I open this, I can see that my object is inside of there. This is not so important, but if we want to ungroup this, we can go to edit, and ungroup. We can ungroup that. Then we can delete this little locator. And if you have the outliner open, you can double click this and change the name from something really long to something short. But the outliner is a place where we can select objects in our scene. And now we have this, our object that we want to use the sculpting tools with. Okay, so now we're seeing the model with the lines on it, the polygons. Now, in Rhino, subdivision surfaces are toggled with the tab key. In Maya, we can toggle this with the 1 key, the 2 key, and the 3 key. So by default, we're seeing this in the flat mode, which is the 1 key. If I hit 2 on the keyboard, I'm seeing the smooth sub-D surface and the smooth mesh preview and the low polygon cage. And then if I hit 3, select the object, hit 3, I'm seeing the smooth version. Okay, so why is this important? Well, you can see here that where we have seams coming from Rhino, the model is not joined. And that's going to create a problem when I use the sculpting tools. For example, if I want to start sculpting on this object, I could come up to the Sculpting tab. With this object selected, if I select any of the tools for sculpting, I go into sculpting mode. And if I start running the sculpting, this default sculpting tool over the model, you can see that it's opening those seams up, which is not what we want. We want this whole thing to remain a closed solid. So we have to use a little tip for that. So I'm going to go back to select here and hit Control Z to undo. And we go back to where we were. Now I'm navigating with my little space mouse, but if you are new to Maya, you need to hold down on the Alt key to navigate. And with the Alt key selected, you can use first of all, I'm going to focus on this object again, and then with the Alt key selected, I can use the left mouse button to rotate, the right mouse button to zoom in and out, or I could use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out, or I can press down on the scroll key with Alt selected and pan around. The other hotkeys that would be helpful to know for Maya is Q selects, W is what we use to move, and R is what we use to scale. T and Y are also hotkeys which you'll use if you have any other kind of transforms on it that can be operated with those keys. You'll see that my scale for this object is not in the center of it, and that's because when it imported, it put the origin of this object at the 0, 0 spot within Maya. If I want to change that, I can go to Modify Center Pivot. So that was under the Modify window here. And now if I hit W, I can move it, or R to scale it, or E to rotate it using the centroid of this object. All right, Okay, so how do we link this up? Well, get rid of these. You can see here I'm in smooth mode and these vertices are not attached. So how do I fix this? Well, what I want to do, number one, need to make sure that modeling is, the modeling pull down is selected, because Maya has so many tools that you will see different menu options up here depending on what pull down you have selected here at the top left. So we are going to use the modeling pull down for this tutorial, and we just need to come up here and point out all of the mesh windows that are, or mesh, yes, the mesh pull down windows here. I'm not sure why Maya organizes them this way, but there's mesh, edit mesh, mesh tools. These three all collect mesh tools, and why they're organized in these three different pull downs, I'm not sure. There's also a poly modeling tab here, which collects some of the tools that you find in these pull down windows, but not all of them. So let's just keep the sculpting tab. Also, there is a modeling toolkit to the right to make things a little more complicated that also collects some of these tools, just puts them in a different, maybe more convenient spot. But everything you'll find here will be within these drop-down windows. All right, so I'm going to toggle off the modeling toolkit. What do we want to do to close up these seams? Well, under Edit Mesh, there's going to be a command called Merge. And merge basically just uses a distance threshold, and 0.01 is adequate for what I have here. And it basically just zaps vertices together and welds them together within a certain proximity, this distance threshold. So I can get rid of that, that little pop-up by going back to the Select tool here or hitting Q on my keyboard, and now I have my model all sewn up. And what that means is I could come back to the sculpting tool and start rolling over this. I'm going to undo, because before, the beauty of the sculpting tool really comes into play when you have many more polygons than what I have here. So I need to add more detail to this model in order to get good resolution. So how do I do that? Well, I could, again, the other thing about Maya, if you're not familiar with the interface, is that I can also pull off these different windows or these drop-down windows, and that makes it easier to see the tools. There are a couple of ways that we can make this a denser mesh. One is to add divisions to it. So you can see that I just added more divisions, and the shape did not change. So I should also maybe go back to one mode here. When I added divisions, it didn't smooth it at all. So this would be the equivalent of using the crease tool on all of the vertices in Rhino, or all of the edges, applying the crease tool to all of the edges in Rhino and then running add divisions. Maya makes that step easy with the add divisions command here. The other way that we can add divisions to this is under the mesh window here, you'll find smooth. And so add divisions is found under edit mesh, and smooth is found under mesh. But smooth also adds divisions, but it pulls the geometry inward and smooths it as it adds those divisions. So I did one of each step. I added divisions, and then I hit smooth, and this is a pretty dense mesh. Maybe I'll smooth it one more time just to make it really dense. And did it work? I need to actually select the mesh, and then let's smooth it. Okay, cool. Now we have a lot of polygons, and I'm going to click out of this, and let's proceed with the sculpt tools. I am maybe now going to turn off the, well, what you'll see actually is that when we enter the sculpt tool, we are going to, it's going to get rid of some of the, or those dark lines for the poly mesh won't be so dark. I don't know if we can turn them off altogether. It looks like they're still on here. There might be a way to hide them, but this is fine because they're not so obtrusive. So this first brush, so sculpting uses brushes, and I'm going to, also one issue that you may have when you bring your Rhino model over, I should bring up Rhino. And for a lot of these tutorials, I haven't really been worried about scale or the units that I'm working in. I will point out, however, that I brought this, I set up my unit space here as centimeters within Rhino before I exported this object, because I know that Maya, by default, if we go to Windows and Setting Preferences, under the preferences, I know that the units here, let's see, somewhere in here, are going to find interface, settings, right, just under settings, we can see here that the working units by default in Maya set to centimeters as well. So this makes the transferring between Maya and Rhino a little more seamless in this case. If you bring your model in at a different scale, what you might find is that your brush is either really, really big. You might just see this little dot and think, oh, I have no brush. But in fact, if you zoom out like really far, you'll see that your brush is massive. So there are a couple of ways to change the size of the brush. One way is to hold down on the B key and then move your mouse to the left or right. And this is going to change the size of your brush. The other way is to come up here to the tool settings. My tool settings are docked here. Yours may be floating. It doesn't really matter. But here with the tools, we can also change the size of the brush. So we can scale this up. So this is really big, and I'm going to undo that. Or we can bring it down to a smaller size. And then you can see that I am using what is known as the lift brush here. And the lift brush is kind of inflating the surface, although I shouldn't say inflate because there is an inflate brush, I believe. But this is lifting the surface. And I'm using the brush side here. Again, I can hold down on the B key to make it a little bigger. By holding down on, so lifting by default is pulling it out. If I hold down on the control key, that's going to push it in. So I can use the same tool to both push and pull the surface by modifying it with control. So by default, I'm lifting the surface, and then if I hold down on control, I'm kind of flattening it out. Now there's also the shift key, and the shift key smooths out any, it sort of takes like whatever harsh geometry I've created and smooths it a little bit. It's difficult to see here, but yeah, you can kind of see it when it's happening here. If you can find my cursor over here to the left, I'm taking the edge off of whatever sculpt I just did by holding down on shift. It's not quite like erase, but it sort of smooths out the rougher edges. So you can see here that I have a pretty sharp edge on this coming from the original model. If I hold down on shift, I'm not changing that much. Now I'm just using the normal brush, and now if I hold down on shift, I can kind of smooth that out a little bit. All right, not real dramatic for this. I can also invert things over here, and that's going to make pushing in the default, and then if I hold down on control, that's going to then lift it up again. So you can toggle that with this invert button here. Now, of course, there's the strength. So strength is going to, like if I make this really, I could have a small size, but high strength, and I'm pushing in there. So let me undo that and unclick invert. But you can see that I'm really quickly getting this, these bubbles lifting off the surface. Because I have a high strength, I can bring that up even more, and you can see these things really pop off really fast. And then if I lower my strength, then I am more gently lifting the surface here. There's also the build-up, and you can play around with the strength and the build-up. So I could have a low build-up and a high strength, and that's going to still more gently lift the surface. Or I could have a, let's say a medium buildup, which is kind of like a 50, and that with a higher strength is going to lead us to pulling out this, lifting the surface more aggressively, and then I could bring this down. Okay, cool. So there are a lot of default brushes here that you can play with. There's lifting, there's smooth, there's sharpen, and we can pull single vertices. There's random, there's softly lifting a surface, and you can play around with these. Now you see I get a little texture here when I softly lift the surface, and that's because I think the most powerful thing you can do with brushes in Maya is to use a stamp. And some of these tools are designed with a stamp in mind, like this one that looks like a stamp. But actually, most of the tools here, a stamp can be applied to. So for example, I could have the lift brush on, and here in the tool, I can scroll down to stamp. And I have a stamp loaded here, but I'm not using it yet. But I could click on use stamp, and then let's see, like raise the, oops, hold down on B. I'm making the brush a little bit bigger. And you can see that I'm still now lifting the surface, but I'm adding this like this texture to it. Let's see what happens if I go and increase the strength of this thing. Okay, now you can see that that texture is coming on. Now I'm still getting the lift, the bubble-like lifting of the surface, but now there's a texture coming along with the lift, which is pretty cool. And so I would experiment with using stamps with different types of brushes because, for example, the lift tool is both going to change the geometry while applying the stamp, but other tools like, for example, this one, which is randomly spray a stamp imprint on a surface. If I select this one, and like you can see I have a different stamp loaded here, you can see that I'm actually adding quite a lot of dramatic texture here, but I'm not really changing the base geometry. So it's not lifting it up as much. It's just the lift is coming from the application of the stamp. And I can come back in here and change the size of the brush. And you can see I'm getting this kind of smaller. Let's change the strength. You can see I'm really dialing in the way that I want that texture to come in. And it's not really fundamentally changing the geometry, except to add these little bumps to the surface. So this is working pretty well. And so let me show you how you could, so this is the randomly spray a stamp imprint on a surface. There's also the stamp tool. You can see that I have a custom image loaded here. But if I use this one, then I'm kind of dragging out the image and then kind of releasing it onto the object. And this had a certain strength to it. I could lower that down, so I'm trying to undo here. And let's show how we could pick a stamp though. So let's say we didn't want this stamp. Let's pick a stamp, and by default, there are going to be some stamps available in Maya. So you'll find these sculpting stamps, and we could use maybe, I don't know, this coral is pretty good. So this blue coral, we won't see the color, but once we have that selected, we can just close this dialog box, and then we can kind of drag this out, and bonk. You can see we get this coral-like texture on the surface. Now, if we didn't want it so strong, we could play with the strength of this brush. So let's go back up and change the strength to something that's a little more subtle. And so let's see how that plays out. Now it's a little more subtle. And we can also, maybe it makes more sense to use an invert in this case. Then we drag this out, and then it gets pushed down into the surface. So this allows me to kind of drag out. Now, if it's really small, I'm not seeing much of the pattern. Would have to make the mesh more dense here to get that pattern. So that's the single stamp. And then there's what's the stamp a pattern on the surface repeatedly. What stamp do I have here? I have this, what is this one called? This is the leaf vein texture. So I can sort of drag this on. Maybe I want to increase both the size of this brush. So I'll hold down on B, B, and make the brush a little bigger. Then I'm going to change the strength here. So I'm getting more texture, getting this sort of texture on the model here. Okay, so I'm getting this kind of thing. And then you can bring your own pattern into, you can use your own pattern for the stamp as well. Now it's really only using a black and white value for this. So, but let's just show how we could use a, now there are also settings for these things here, where you can randomize the rotation, you can change the scale, randomize the scale as you draw it around. So all of these things will kind of change the way that the texture gets applied. And to erase, I'm just hitting Control Z. Okay, so how about bringing in we haven't done much over here. So how would we begin to bring in our own stamp? All we need to do is select Import, and I've already browsed to a folder where I, from the internet, found this image. And actually, let's see if I can right-click this thing. You know what I want to do quickly is, well, let's just bring it in and as it is. Oops. So I'll bring that in. It's called Crack. Open. And then I can apply this. Let's see here. Let's change the strength. Undo invert. And it's giving us some texture. I'm curious what would happen if I changed this to a black and white image. So I'm just going to pause the video and edit it in Photoshop and see if we get any difference here. Okay, we're back. So I just opened that image in Photoshop and played with the levels. So let's re-import it. It's now Crack 2, and you can see that it's there's much more contrast in it. Let's see if that makes a difference. It does seem to at least respond a little bit more readily to adding the texture. Oops, did not mean to save it. And let's see if we can change the strength of it, maybe change the size. See if we got. Anyway, it's fairly subtle, so you'll have to experiment with what different images bring in as far as your texturing. Okay, so let's go ahead and bring this back into, let's do maybe one more kind of aggressive text. Oops, I'm going to hit F. I flew inside the object and now I'm back outside. So let's maybe do one more bit of sculpting here. I don't know if there are any other tools that we can fill in the valleys of a surface. You'll just have to really experiment with these. Maybe I want to put some scrapes into this thing. So let's use the stamp a pattern on a surface repeatedly. What's this? This is level surface sharpens. Let's see. Minimize, cut fine strokes into a surface. So that's kind of cutting a finer stroke into a surface. Let's see if we use a stamp with that. So there's a stamp on this already. So you can kind of see how that is like cutting into the surface. Let's pick a different stamp. Let's use these, maybe if there's fibers. Let's try these Bristol scrapes. Let's try that. And you can kind of put these cuts into the surface. Let's maybe lower the size and bring up the strength, and that's kind of giving it more of a, let's go back to the stamp a pattern on a surface repeatedly and change it to those Bristol. Oops, let's go back to pick stamp. Try these with this. Raise the size of the brush. It's not doing a whole lot for me here. Maybe if we change this size, the strength maybe. It's kind of warping. I think it's because I have a randomizing thing on here. So let's not randomize the scale or anything like that. Ah, there. Now we're getting like scrapes into it more. But these are a little dramatic. So let's bring the scale of the brush down and maybe the strength down a little bit. And then I'm kind of carving these things in. We could try how that might work with like a different brush. So now we have the lift brush. And we could, let's try, oops, not importing, but picking this same thing. Okay, I like that better actually. Now I'm gonna hold down on Shift, and you can see that Shift kind of smooths that out. Okay, so I kind of like these sorts of scrapes that I'm getting across the surface here. And this is just using the lift brush with this stamp and playing with the size. And then if I want to get rid of something or mellow it out, I can hold down on, this is lifting it up. I could carve it in by holding down on Control. Let's see what that does. I haven't really textured the surface yet. Now that kind of creates these furrows in the surface. And then I could hold down on Shift and soften them a little bit if I wanted to, maybe in that area, something like that. Okay, so let's go back into Rhino with this. And before I do that, let's toggle off this. I'm going to go out of Sculpt and then hit, I can go out of Sculpt just by hitting Q or using the Select tool. And now perhaps I don't want to see the wireframe here. So I'm toggling that off. And now I'm just seeing the geometry. One thing that would have been good to do at the very beginning would be to check the UVs. I should have done this at the outset, but if I turn on the UV editor, I am going to see that my UV tile here is the same as the one in Rhino. Now I can look at this and see that it's very clean, so it's not really reflecting the changes that I've made here. But I can do that by, so again, up here under UV with this object selected, I can go to UV editor. And then I can optimize this to bake in the changes that I've made. So how would I do that? So tools, I can somewhere, we can, okay, under modify, I can click optimize. And it's going to spin for a minute. And then we should see a change. I can see down here it's queuing. Okay, so you can see that the shapes shift a little bit, but we're still on a tile, and that's good. And you can see that they have a little bit more wobble in here. So that's telling me that the texture has now been applied to this object. And this is looking pretty good. The sculpt has been applied to this UV map. The other place I could do that is over here. You'll be able to see it hopefully if you have a higher resolution screen than the one I'm using. Just like there's a modeling toolkit and some other things over here, there's this UV toolkit. And I have to kind of dig down a little bit to find it. But here under, like you can also find the under unfold this optimize tool. So I could hit optimize again even, and it's going to do another pass at optimizing this this layout. You can see here that it's cranking down here. And Maya, unlike Rhino, has much more robust UV editing tools. And like there's this dedicated UV editor, and there are many tools here for making your UVs better. And so the important thing here is that we don't have any overlapping UVs, and this all looks pretty good. So I'm just going to accept that. Now, what this is telling me is that, or what I want to point out with this is that our geometry has changed. We've added more polygons, and so we're going to have to re-import this model back into Rhino as a new model, and then check the UVs. Okay, so let's export this. I'm going to close the UV toolkit, and I am now going to File, export this back to Rhino. So export selection. And what do I have selected here? I'm using FBX export. And you can also use OBJ. OBJ is great. But let's use FBX. And one thing that we'll have to do here, so let's do, call this back to Rhino, this file. And what we need to do here under the file specific options. So under the options here, we want to come down to axis conversion and change the, make sure that the up axis is set to Z. Because by default in Maya, it is Y. And when we go back into Rhino, we want the file to be Z. And that is because for some reason with Rhino, when you're importing an FBX, it doesn't give you the option to toggle it. And if you can't find this, you can export you can also export this as an OBJ file, which that's a common object or common option down here, the OBJ export. And OBJ does within Rhino, when you import an OBJ, has the option to flip it to the new axis. But now that we've set this to up axis to Z, then we should be fine. So we're going to, we've named it back to Rhino, export selection, and boom, and it's, you can see here that it has saved it here. Let's save it again, file, export. Export selection, and that's simply because I want to let's see, put it on the desktop, export for Maya. Let's call this back to Rhino. Cool. That way I'll know exactly where it is. Okay, speaking of Rhino, I'm going to hide this. Let's bring this thing back into Rhino. All right, file, import, and it's on my desktop for Maya, back to Rhino, FBX, open, bring the options open. So what you can see here is that when I import this thing, it is not giving me the option to flip the Y and Z axis. So that's why I had to do it when I did the actual export from Maya. All right, and here's my object. And if we go back to show, you can see that it's actually, hide that's the other one. You can see that this is exactly overlaying the original mesh. Let me hide that. And here we have all of this displacement on the object. And let us go to the rendered view. And now we can see all of this detail, which we did in Maya, and would have been really difficult to do in Rhino, and we would not have been able to do this just with normal displacement, because we are putting the displacement in really specific areas. Now let's go back. So we could then take this into Substance, back to Substance, and we probably could have done that from, well, it's just probably good to come back into Rhino. We might be able to go right from Rhino, but let's or right from Maya, but let's also now double check the UVs here. And you can see that we have these nice UVs coming in from Maya, and they're in the right spot, which means that we can take this into Substance and texture it and apply, create a new material and use it in Rhino. Okay, so that's the bulk. That's the bulk of what I wanted to show you all. But I do, as a little, let's say, last tip for doing this, I do want to show you what if I want to show you how to freeze things when sculpting in Maya, and so what it would be the advantage of that. So let's say we wanted to selectively just put displacement in that pocket, then we didn't want to texture anything else. How would we be able to, how would we do that? Okay, so let's jump back into Maya, and I'll show you that as a last thing. Okay, so this is what we did. I'm just going to get rid of this. Let's go back to, let's just do a new scene. Let's not save anything. We're going to file, import. Oops, let's not import it. let's just drag our, so this is the original file that we had before. Let's hit F to see everything. I'm going to edit, ungroup this is optional, but we're going to ungroup this, select this, edit, ungroup, get rid of that, give this a nicer name. And then I have to, again, fix, because if I hit the 3 key to smooth this, I'm going to see that little gaps open up. So I am going to edit mesh, let's see, edit mesh and merge. And that takes care of that. And let's now, I'm going to open the modeling toolkit. I can smooth this a couple times. I could also just add more divisions when I'm smoothing it. And now I am going to close the modeling toolkit, and this is ready to sculpt. And I could, of course, then double check my UVs here, UV editor, and everything looks good. What's nice is that as I add divisions and smooth things, those divisions show up here. When I sculpt, I need to optimize it to make those changes show up. All right, so let's sculpt this thing, but okay. So we could turn on the sculpt by pressing any of the sculpting tools, but instead of, and I'm going to come over here and bring up the tool settings. Instead of going right into a sculpt, I want to use the freeze, this little freeze button here. So paint areas of a surface to prevent further modification. So if I don't want this, let's make sure I don't have any stamps. Oh, okay, great. So you can see here that, oops, why is this? Da, 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 da. Let's see here. So I should be able to simply turn off steady stroke here. This should be showing blue. I was having this happen earlier. Let's see if we flood this. I think it's still working, but it's not showing. So what I'm going to do is pause the video and bring it back up, because there's some little bug in the system here and I don't want to bore you trying to figure it out. So let me pause it. Okay, I figured it out. And I think that what happened was that I had the, I had to invert clicked here. And so it wasn't showing up. So now when I paint on this surface, it is creating a blue mask on this. And what this means is now if I, let's say, come back to this stamp, we probably do have a stamp in this thing, and then maybe make the brush size a little bigger. I can drag, you can see I'm dragging the sculpt tool across the surface here, and but it's not going into the area where I have masked it off. I can now get rid of that. If I go back to the freeze tool here, I can unfreeze all, get rid of that, and then come back to the stamp tool and scrape away at this thing. Okay, so I'm going to do this, and let's come back to this and unfreeze all. Let's say I just want to freeze this area. I could do this in a couple of different ways. I could, it's going to be easier for me to paint this area that I want to mask, and then I could hit invert, right? And then I could bring the brush size down a little bit. So that flips where I'm masking, and then I could make this a little bit bigger. I could continue to sort of paint this in here. Control erases, so that inverts it. And then also Shift is going to kind of blur things out. So I could come back and sort of paint all of that in, and so I just want my masks. I'm not going to do this very precisely, but I could, you know, take the brush size down and really come in here and kind of tweak this until I have exactly where I want it. But let's just live with this. Maybe I'll hit it a little bit more, and then come back with the Shift key and blur that out a little bit. So, okay, so now I have my mask, and let's say we want to add texture to this. Maybe I'll use a stamp. So let's use a stamp here, and let's pick a stamp, something we haven't used yet. So maybe or we'll just use this leaf vein again. Let's try that. And now drag this out. And you can see that I'm getting this texture just in this zone, right? And nowhere else. Like I can't draw this out anywhere else on the surface. But then I could come back to freeze here and unfreeze all, and then come back to this, I don't know, maybe this tool, pick a different stamp, maybe, I don't know, maybe like that one, or I haven't tried this rake yet, so let's try that. Make the brush a little bigger, oops, see, make the brush a little bigger, and I'm kind of raking this across. So you can see now I can go across the whole thing again. So freezing can be helpful if you only want to selectively modify the surface. And then if I wanted to bring this back into Rhino, this was my beautiful sculpt, I would just want to go back to the UV editor here, go to Tools, Modify rather, Optimize, run the optimization to make sure that we're baking in all of the displacement that we've added. We can really see it here. And then we could go back to File, Export Selection, and export this as an FBX, making sure that we have our up axis set to Z. And then in Rhino, we will, let's kind of check, oops, hide. We're going to be working with things like this. We're looking at things like this, and then these could go back into, these could be 3D printed. You will see that this is should be a closed mesh, so that's great. So we could 3D print this, or we could, of course, take it into Substance Designer for further texturing. And that's the tutorial. Thanks for watching.